And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am Hank Garner, your host, as always. And today I am really, really excited to have Susan Stokes-Chapman on the show with us to talk about her brand new book and also to talk about some interesting aspects of historical fiction. Her new book is called The Shadow Key. You might also know her previous book, uh, Pandora, that came out was a couple of years ago,
It,
Susan, last
it
year or the year
was
before.
it was last was it? It was last year, I think. January
Yeah,
last year.
I know there's been a stagger in the publishing between the
Mm,
UK and the States. So,
yes.
when did it come out? Well, it depends on where you're talking about. But both of these books are so much fun. I actually recently went back and reread Pandora after I read The Shadow Key, because your publisher was so gracious to send an advanced reader copy of The Shadow Key. Loved it so much. Had picked up Pandora a couple of years ago when it first came out. Had forgotten what a fun read that was and
Oh,
got to enjoy it all over again. So anyway, huge fan of what you're doing and can't wait to talk about it. I said all that to say welcome to the show.
thank you very much, Hank. Happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you. Susan, I love to start the conversation with a fun icebreaker. And one question that I love to ask people is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, uh, I've always been a reader. I think that's pretty much a very boring, straight, kind of straight answer there. So always been very, very booky. And I've always had a bit of a passion for anything historical because I grew up here in the UK. One of our mainstream channels is the BBC, and
Right.
in the 80s, 90s, there was regularly a BBC Sunday evening period drama that they would televise, and so I grew up around those. Um, and I think what particularly got me into the Georgians was the 1995 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. So that was where the love of the history came about. And I remember reading extensively novels either from that period, such as Austen, for instance, or novels written in that period. And so to answer your question, my main kind of memory, my first memory of wanting to be a writer, and specifically a writer of historical Georgian fiction, was that in the 70s there was an American author named Shirley Busby who wrote what my mother would scathingly call corset rippers. But they were romance novels, and there was a little bit of extra things happening in there as well. But what it was that I loved about Shirley Busby's books, and I think I was lent one of these books by a friend at school, and I'm not even sure how she ended up getting hold of them, because obviously we're here in the UK. But I started scouring kind of book market stalls for Shirley Busby books because I just loved her so much. And the reason why I did is because she didn't just write a romance. She wrote such her world building was just so cleverly done. She was a master of bringing the Georgian period to life in such an authentic way. She would, a little bit like I did, I suppose, in Pandora when I used William Hamilton, who was a real person. She
Right.
used real people, real life events, and she wove a compelling and believable storyline through that history. It just happened to have a little bit of rumpy pumpy romance in it. But honestly, I think it was just her skill of writing, her ability to set a scene so beautifully in an historical setting, and that is definitely my very first memory. And the book that I read first by Shirley Busby was called While Passion Sleeps. So any listeners out there, get Googling. But yeah, that would be my first memory.
Well, I want to stick a pin in that because I definitely have on my little notes here to ask you about historical fiction, and specifically what I love to talk to historical fiction authors about is this interesting way that historical fiction. Okay, I'm going to have to qualify what I'm saying. The thing about history is the farther we get from an historical event, the more that event gets reduced to just bullet
Mm.
points. I think
Yeah.
we've all been in history class and in high school or whatever, and we go through all of these. We try to cover the history of the world in a semester, and you wind up with just little bullet points of the so and so did this and this year, and we miss all of the context and all of the details around that to get to this one bullet point. And the thing that I love about historical fiction is that we're able to recreate a plausible, sometimes, a lot of times I would say a plausible um, connection for that,
Yeah.
um, a reasoning for why this stuff happened, or that we bring some humanity back. I guess is
Yes.
what I'm really trying to say, and so I want to explore that in just a minute. But what is it about the Georgian uh, period that appeals to you?
Well, aside from that Pride and Prejudice adaptation that I told you about, it's such a long and compelling period of history. So it started from 1721 all the way up to 1830. So that's a massive window that you can
Sure.
play about with. Obviously, here in the UK, it would have been called the Georgian period, and then a little bit of it was the Regency period as well. Anywhere else, obviously, it's just the 18th century. But there was so much that happened in that period that I think many people overlook. So, the Industrial Revolution, for instance, a lot of people assume that was the Victorians, but actually, it would have started initially in the Georgian period. Typically, I'd say around 1818 through to about 1820. There was a lot of innovation that was happening around that time. Earlier in the period as well, the Enlightenment had happened, so that was that shift
Mhm.
from esoterical thinking almost into a scientific frame of mind. So that shift happened as well in the Georgian period. Um, Obviously, I find all kind of areas of it interesting in terms of I think we're all kind of overly familiar with the Bridgerton-esque sort of
Mhm.
feel of the Georgian
Sure.
period. When we say the Georgians, that is kind of what we think about, and we think of the royal line as well. So obviously,
Right.
all the Georges, the Prince Regent, um, and of course that is compelling, and that again with the Shirley Busby novels, that kind of scene is the sort of thing that led me in. But on my research, I found out an awful lot about the other classes as well, and I suppose I do find that social sphere incredibly interesting. With Pandora, I explored it with the dock workers and
Right.
the bookbinding industry, and obviously Dora herself and Hezekiah in terms of the black market. So that kind of nitty gritty, dirty old London kind of thing was really kind of compelling for me. And then with the Shadow Key as well, the juxtaposition between the upper classes of Julian and Lord Pennant, and then obviously the villagers of Penhelig. And I've just always found exploring those different social classes extremely interesting. And there's one hell of a lot of great fiction, not non-fiction works that you can read about that, and I just find that more meatier. I find that really easy to get my teeth into. You were mentioning earlier how the historical fiction, obviously, the further away we get, it turns into bullet points.
Mhm.
I find researching the lives of the more unknown gives us a way in, I think, a little bit more than the upper classes and the royal kind of element. I think it allows you to understand the social nuances a lot more. I think it allows the writer and the reader to essentially shape the world
Mhm.
in their imagination far better if we start exploring the lives of people who are like us. From a lot of the issues that we have today obviously would have existed then, in terms of worrying about money, housing situations, the economy, all that sort of thing. And to do it through the eyes of people like us, but in historical context. I just think that's really, really gripping for me. I find that really fun to explore.
The well, first off, before I ask you this question I have about Pandora, the um when we talk about people becoming writers, a lot of times when I ask that first question about what's your first memory, a lot of times it's a very early memory that people have. It's like this gene inside us, if you want to look at it that way, that the writer gene gets switched on early in life.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we know anything about writers, there's normally a fairly circuitous route that leads us to the decision to tackle that first novel, or whatever. And you go and collect this experience in life over here. You work this job, you meet these people, collect all of this life experience, and each one of those things you file away in your file cabinet. You put it in your toolbox as something that you'll pull back out at a later time, and you'll all of a sudden realize, oh, this is why I had that experience in life. It enabled me to better characterize this person, and to bring this thing out into the open. What was it that brought you, because you told about this early experience and this story that really captured your imagination? What was it that brought you back around and said, okay, now is the time that I should start telling this tale?
Well, when I read that first Shirley Busby book, I was probably around 14 years old. So I was already then thinking, I can write a romance, I can do that. And I started coming up with absolutely ridiculous character names, and I filed those away, and just book ideas that obviously have disappeared off into the ether now. But I read extensively, as I said, for the period, because I knew if I was going to write anything, that would be it. And essentially what happened is that I decided to go to university, and I did a Bachelor of Arts in Education and English Literature, and then I went on to do a Master of Arts in Creative Writing. Now, during the master's degree, I chose a lot of Romanticism modules. So again, I told you I was very interested in real figures, and in terms of the literature element, it made sense to study the Romantics, so Keats and Byron and Shelley. And when I was in this one particular Romanticism seminar, I heard about a man named William Hazlitt. Not many people really know who he is, but he did walk in the same circles as Keats and Byron and Shelley, etc. He was essentially a journalist. He was quite controversial in the sense of many people disagreed with the things that he said, but he published extensively, many essays, and that was all by the by. That was fair enough. But what completely fascinated me about William Hazlitt is that he is also known for writing a book called the Liber Amoris. So that is his book of love. And that came about because he ended up developing a rather inappropriate obsession with his landlady's daughter, who was like 25 years her junior. And her being a serving girl, there wasn't really much she could do in terms of shunning his advances, simply because he is a tenant. Right. She has to please each of the tenants, and but there was a bit of a screw loose with William Hazlitt. If she smiled at him, suddenly he thought that was it. She was completely in love with him, and this obsession kind of continued for about 2 or 3 years, until he finally went to Scotland and contrived a way to divorce his wife. He was separated from his wife at the time, but he wanted to get rid of her completely, and he does it successfully. And he comes back and he basically says, "Right, Sarah, that's it, I'm free." And she's like, "Nah, no, thank you." And in his anguish, he writes this book, and it is the most awful thing. He has essentially documented these conversations between he and her, and then published as well his letters of heartache to two of his friends. And it was initially published anonymously, but because he hadn't shut up about Sarah Walker this whole time, everybody knew who had written it. He became a laughing stock. Sarah Walker and her family didn't do too well out of it either. But obviously, everything that we know about this is because it's all from William Hazlitt, and it's from his contemporaries and the friends that he wrote to, and the wife that actually met the girl. She's essentially an unknown voice. And I found that story incredibly compelling. And so I decided that I was going to write it. I wanted to write the story from Sarah Walker's point of view, using Lee Remorse as a springboard. But let's put a pin in that for a second, simply because I was from a low-income background. I obviously wanted to be a writer, and I jumped at being a writer, but I had to go out and get a job really after graduating. And I struggled with that actually for quite a while. I had a very, very small stint in a publishing house. But it was all working for free as a kind of assistant just to get work experience. And then there wasn't a job at the end of it. And I then had to move back to the Midlands because I moved to London briefly to do that. The money ran out, so I moved back to the Midlands, and I ended up in a job that I absolutely hated. And I ended up staying there for 7.5 years. And the thing that really kind of pulled me back to circle back is because I was just so miserable in this job. It was a job where the hours were unsavory. It wasn't just 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. It was all the hours that God could give, 7 days a week sometimes. And I could actually just feel my brain cells dying one by one. And I thought, that's it. I can't do this anymore. And so I pulled all these notes out. And I had been thinking about the novel on and off for quite a few years, but I never actually did anything about it until about 5 years later. I was like, no, that's it. We're getting on with it. And I did. And I wrote it. And I wrote about 7 different drafts of it. And it got rejected by 45 agents. And that was about 2.5 years work there. But really, that's a bit of a 10-year stretch of kind of being passionate about this one story. If anybody's interested, there is information about this book on my website. It has been shelved. I do plan to revisit it at some point. But I think in writing that novel, I learned a lot about myself as a writer. I learned a lot about the publishing process and how it isn't smooth sailing.
Right.
But it also gave me the determination, because I could very easily have quit at that point, 40 plus rejections for an idea that I was flogging a dead horse at this point. But I was just so determined to be published. I could only ever really see myself as a writer. I'd always wanted to be a writer since probably before 14 years old, but I made that conscious decision that I was going to do it at 14 years old. And so I just didn't want to waste all of that work. And so it was probably about 2 weeks after the final rejection of that book that the idea for Pandora just kind of popped into my head. And Dora and Hermes, they both came in fully formed. But I was feeling a bit despondent. I was in a job that I liked at that point, but I basically decided that I was going to sit on this idea for about 6 months because I was completely exhausted. I didn't want to be writing anymore for the moment because, it's hard work when you try very hard and then just get rejected constantly. So I sat on this idea for 6 months and I thought, if it's still there in 6 months, I'm going to pursue it. And it was. And so I did. And I keep calling Pandora my fluke novel because everything just happened so quickly from that. And it all just took off from there. For which I'm very, very grateful. But yeah, that's essentially the kind of rambling answer to your question.
I think a lot of writers have that idea that they have in the back of their head, and they think one day this will be the thing that I'm most passionate about and that I'll write. And for whatever reason, maybe it finds a place in publishing or something, but sometimes it doesn't. I've had a story like that I was very passionate about, that I don't know if it's haven't had the confidence to write the way that I see it in my head, or I'm not the writer that I need to be, or whatever it is. but I know that one day I'll be able to write that book.
Yeah.
Now that you've had two books out that have had quite a bit of success, looking back on that project that you were so passionate about and want to bring out, can you now look at that and see, oh, well, this is what I was missing at the time,
Yeah.
or was the market just not right for it? Because that happens a lot. You can have a
Mm.
perfect book and the market's just not ready for it, and that that stuff happens. But at this point, can you look at that book with different eyes and say, oh, okay, now I kind of see
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
it lost its footing or whatever.
Exactly. I mean, yes, absolutely, I can. I think there was an element of the market wasn't quite there either. I must admit, I'm not 100% sure why, because at that point, the Me Too and the Time's Up movement was quite prevalent. But I don't think I'd written that book to. I don't think it was the best it could have been. I thought it was at the time, but
Yeah.
yes, now in hindsight, I can definitely see areas that I will absolutely have to rewrite, and it was missing some elements of pacing because also I was very wedded to the Liber Amoris. I was trying very hard to kind of emulate it on Sarah's point of view. I had
Mhm.
essentially this sort of very specific text and timeline that I was trying to adhere to. And I've learned as a writer that actually in history, you don't always have to adhere to it 100%. I'm a big stickler for the author's note. I think that is incredibly important to put at the back of a book because you can explain that if you decide to change areas of history or something about a real person who is a character in the book, um, I think you need to be able to explain yourself. I think you need to be able to give a good reason why. Um, but I just at the time, I didn't want to change anything, or I didn't want to suggest something that hadn't been recorded. Whereas now I think there are certain things I could do with Hazlitt, for instance, that just because he didn't write about it in the Liber Amoris doesn't mean to say it didn't happen, so to speak, without kind
Right.
of doing too many spoilers, just in case I do end up
Yeah.
releasing it. But yes, I can definitely see ways that I could have changed certain events in that book and yet still have been true to Sarah's story and what I
Yeah.
was trying to do. So when I do eventually go back to it, I will be rewriting certain areas, and I'm hoping then next time around, with that hindsight and being a better writer as well, because I I can definitely see areas of that book if I look back at the manuscript and think, actually, I really liked that, and that's a strong piece of writing. But there are other very weak areas as well. So, yes, I definitely can see where I went wrong, so to speak, and I can already envision ways to improve it.
Well, speaking of historical fiction, and you hit on something that is of utmost uh, importance to readers of historical fiction is, um, yes, that this and I know lots of people that get all of their history from historical fiction,
Mm,
and while that is, I applaud the fact that we have so many people telling stories about points of history that just get glossed over in our education system. That's a rant for another time. Um, but you also have to be careful because in the title is fiction. There's
mm.
we don't know that this is exactly how it happened.
No,
So as a
we're filling
historical,
in gaps, aren't
r-
we? We're
right,
we're
yeah,
reimagining certain elements of it.
right. So as a historical fiction author, where do you draw the line on what things that you feel free to change, modify, stretch the truth just a little?
Mm.
And if you do, if you take the things that we know for fact and you change them, do you provide a note, an author's note, like you alluded to a minute ago? Is that how you handle that? I guess what I'm asking is for historical fiction readers, how do they know what things that are anchored in history and what things have been added for entertainment value, so to speak?
Sure. It is a bit of a tricky balance, I must admit. And unless you're specifically saying, I am writing an alternative history, where I think you can get away with changing quite a bit because you're very clear from the off that this is an alternative history.
Right.
I think if you're writing historical fiction and you're tweaking certain things, you do have to be careful. I think, let's use William Hamilton as an example. So William Hamilton is a character in Pandora. He is somebody who did exist. Not many people might have heard of him, but they certainly would have heard of his wife Emma, who was the mistress of Nelson. So that those three people, Hamilton, Emma, and Nelson, they are three very important people in history. If you are familiar with the history of the Napoleonic Wars, for instance. Now, if I had changed that completely and just had William Hamilton there and not acknowledged his wife or even the relationship between Emma and Nelson, even if I do it so subtly, if I had said that they were actually wonderfully happily married or she didn't have an affair with Nelson at all, I feel like that is a fact that happened, and it was a very obvious fact in society as well. The whole of Georgian London knew about it. It was no secret, and I feel if I'd have changed that just wouldn't have worked, and I feel there wouldn't have been a point to it. What I did change was he basically, William Hamilton, had this whole complete Greek vase collection that he collected over many, many years. And because Napoleon's forces were starting to invade, for safety, he shipped all these vases off back to England in a ship, and the ship sank. And he followed officially a year later. But in my novel, I just kind of pushed that forward just a little bit so that he only follows a couple of months afterward. And because that allowed me to fit everything in the timeline. So I didn't do a major change, but I had to. It was still a change, and I felt that it was only right that I did acknowledge that in the author's note. And I think any change an historical writer does make that is clearly wrong because we have facts to verify, I think something needs to be noted there, to be perfectly honest. I really don't agree with people not doing that. I think it's very unfair, because if people are learning their history from novels, a lot of that history could be wrong. Yeah. So I would rather be very, very clear as to what I've changed and what I haven't. I mean, that's a bit of a flimsy sort of example. I think this is personal preference, really, more than anything. It is fiction at the end of the day. If you want to change the whole thing, change the whole thing. But I think personally, I don't mind bending the truth to a certain point, but I don't like completely ignoring major facts.
Yeah.
I think that's essentially the way I look at it.
Yeah. And for my use, when I get really intrigued by a historical event and I want to learn more, that historical fiction is usually a thing that will prod me to go dig into the actual history and find out, what my favorite author has brought to my attention, but then what's been fudged and what's been changed a little bit. Yeah. So historical fiction for me is an entree to new subjects for me to dig into, and I hope more people take it that way as well. Yeah. Your book Pandora is interesting because it's historical fiction, like you alluded to, but it also is a reimagining of the Greek myth of Pandora, which adds a really interesting layer. Where did the impetus for this book come from?
Well, as I said, I had the rejection for that final book, and then 2 weeks later, I don't know how it happened. I mean, the job that I was in at the time required a lot of driving, and I tend to kind of percolate when I'm driving, and sometimes thoughts just pop into my head, and Pandora and Hermes, they just did. I had the idea of a girl who was a jewelry maker, and she had a pet magpie. And then pretty much soon after that, Pandora's box just floated up right underneath them. Yeah. Now, most people know the myth of Pandora's box, but I thought, that's interesting. Can I play with that? Can I do anything with that? Now, at the time I had the idea for Pandora, the influx of Greek myth retellings hadn't actually happened at that point.
Yeah.
Circe had come out, and the Song of Achilles had come out, but nothing else. Now, bear in mind, a lot of time in publishing, a book could be bought 18 months prior to it kind of being on
Of
the
course.
shelf.
Right.
So I had got the idea for Pandora before the whole influx kind of came in, and by the time I'd written it and published it, it was only then that it just seemed to hit this kind of trend wave, which was very, very lucky, I suppose. But the point I'm making is that I wasn't writing that novel to try and fit in with the trend. I didn't know that was going to be a trend at all. It just happened to be very, it just happened that way. So I was just kind of intrigued by this. Now, I am not an ancient world writer. I'm not a fantasy writer either. But I was just really interested to see if I could play about with that. And I have, as a child, always been quite interested in myth and magic. I think those have definitely influenced my writing in some way, even though I'm not a fantasy writer, but I've always quite liked toying about with the idea of what if.
Yeah.
And
Me too.
the ambiguity of it. I really love that as well. And obviously I mentioned William Hamilton, so I won't go off on another lecture about that. But I basically had to consider, how on earth can I use Pandora's box in Georgian London? I was always going to write in the Georgian era, and because the novel that I'd shelved was set in Georgian London, I didn't want to waste any of that work that I'd done. So I basically used a lot of the stuff from that novel in Pandora. It just made sense. I had it all there already. I knew the era. I knew Georgian London. So why didn't I use that? So of course I then had to think about, right, how am I getting a box? Because at the time I didn't realize it was a jar. How am I getting a Greek box into the 18th century? So of course then I went down a Google rabbit hole, and first of all, I searched Pandora's box. And the very first thing that actually comes up is a Wikipedia article that's saying it's not Pandora's box, it's Pandora's jar. And I thought, ooh, that makes it slightly more interesting. Of course, then I looked at Greek antiquity in Georgian London, and that just made things so much easier. And from that, I learned about William Hamilton and his collection of Greek vases. It just basically went from there. I thought, there could be Pandora's jar in the bottom of a shipwreck. That could absolutely happen. So I basically went from there, really.
And Pandora was an instant bestseller. Coming off of the frustration that you felt with that first book, and it never achieving what you wanted it to achieve, and then you said that Pandora came about very quickly for you. It goes through the whole publishing process, is an instant bestseller. Was that a bit of a culture shock to you, that to go, from author obscurity to now someone that people are looking to, and she does amazing things, and that, to go from, but I call it the gift of anonymity, where before anyone knows that you're writing and you're just toiling away on the story, and it's just you and it, and
so much easier, isn't it?
Well, it seemed so frustrating at the time, because I really want to get this thing out to the world, and it's just not working, and all of this. And then looking back, you're like, oh, but those were great times, because no one expected anything from me yet. How did that feel?
Well, yeah, I mean, it did feel like a sucker punch in the gut. I'm not going to lie. I said earlier that I was from a low income background. So to suddenly have some sort of financial security, even it might not last forever, and that's something I'm very, very conscious of. But while I have it, I am now writing full time. So I did quit my job. Not because I didn't like the job. I did like the job, as I said, the second one, not the one I was miserable in. But in terms of a practical sense, both for the marketing element and for delivering the shadow key, I just knew I wouldn't be able to kind of do both. So I bit the bullet, and I became a full-time writer while I could. So that in itself was very, very strange, to suddenly not have to go into a normal job and just be there at my desk writing, and that is all I did. I found that very hard to adapt to, because I think as well, when you are working full time but you still want to be an author, you find those pockets of time to chip away, and sometimes you're far more productive that way as well. Whereas suddenly I was writing full time, and I struggled actually with the second book, partly because of that. I didn't quite know how to manage my time properly. So in terms of the finances, that was incredibly surprising, and I'm very thankful for it as well. But there were loads of different other aspects of that as well. You have suddenly tax thrown at you, and an accountant, and all things I just didn't understand, and
Yeah.
that there are other financial implications as well. So that was very overwhelming. And then of course the fact that it got to number one, after publication, it meant that I had a different kind of pressure when trying to write the shadow key, because as you said, when you're just writing the book and it's just you and the book, you have no pressure whatsoever except the
Right.
pressure that you put on yourself. Whereas once you've had a number one bestseller,
Especially right out of the gate.
I can't really go up from there. The only
Right.
way to go is down. I was very conscious that I was writing a novel set in Wales. There's an obscurity about this book, I must admit, but the Shadow Key, I'd had that idea way before even the shelved novel. And
Mhm.
it was a story I knew I wanted to write, but I was suddenly conscious of the fact that, oh no, this is actually quite different from Pandora, and I'm going to have to please, these readers who are probably expecting another Greek myth to come out the bag, and that was never going to happen.
Yeah.
So I was trying to please readers, my agent, my editor. It was a lot of pressure, and I really did struggle. Whereas Pandora was a 10-month write,
Yeah.
it's taken 2.5 years to do the Shadow Key. And in the grand scheme of things, that's actually still quite a small amount of time to write a novel in. But for me, I felt it was a slog from start to finish. And there were times I was a little bit miserable as
Yeah.
well. Whereas if that had just been me and the Shadow Key and nothing else, I wouldn't have felt anywhere near like that. So yeah, it was definitely a sucker punch to the gut.
Yeah.
It's a whole
And
new world.
And I want to get into talking about the Shadow Key here in just a second, because there's so much to love about this book. But before we do, TW had a great question that she posed. During your education in literature/creative writing, what is the biggest bit of theory you learned that could help
Ooh.
aspiring writers? Because, you know, a, a lot of writers don't have the benefit of the postgraduate
Mm.
education that you got. Uh, I would say the vast majority of writers don't have an MFA. What did you get from the MFA that you now look back on and say, "Oh, I'm so thankful that I learned this," or that this is another tool in my toolbox that I get to pull
Okay.
out?
I'm going to say this first off the
Okay.
bat. You do not need an MFA, an MA. You do not need a degree in creative writing to be a writer. The only reason I did it is because, and this is quite a funny story, my boyfriend at the time was doing a computer science degree, which was 4 years. My education in English literature BA was 3 years, and I needed something to do for the other fourth year. And it was between creative writing or a PGCE, which is basically a teaching course for secondary school. And for various reasons, which I won't go into here, I chose the creative writing degree because it gave me the fourth year. So you don't need the degree at all to be a writer. The only thing you need to do is write and keep writing, and
Yeah.
and don't give up. And the more you write, the more you will develop as a writer, and you'll start honing your craft that way. But to answer that question, there were quite a few things I did learn and I found very useful. More than anything, that MA, it gave me time to write it. It did give me time to develop my voice. But bear in mind, I'm still developing that voice even now. I don't think
Right.
that ever stops. But it did give me time. It gave me the freedom to explore different ideas. In terms of what I was taught, I understood a lot more than I did at that time about genre and different forms of writing. And I learned how that affected different parts of the story in terms of character development, tone, pacing, all that sort of thing. But I think what I found most beneficial was learning how to edit myself. So learning how to edit your work as a writer is invaluable, I think. So in a lot of the classes that we had for creative writing, it often involved you submit a piece of work and then your fellow creative writing students, they critique it. And they tell you basically, this is what isn't working. This is what is working.
Right.
This is how you can develop that a little bit more. And sometimes it was a bit brutal, but you know what? It did really kind of put your feet on the ground and make you realize, you know what? I'm actually not that amazing at this point. And it basically allowed me to be a bit more objective about my creative voice. It helped me edit my work. And I think if I hadn't have had that, at least initially, I might have taken a little bit longer to kind of get off the bat there. Saying that, I would advise anybody who is aspiring to be a writer, if you can get involved with a local writing group, they can do that thing as well. They can help critique your work. They can help you develop it. They can help you. A lot of the time we're wearing rose-tinted glasses. We can't see the wood for the trees. You think you've written something. It's like, oh my God, it's amazing. But then we have a very hard, cold reality where you are writing for a reader. And if the reader isn't seeing what you're seeing, is this making sense? It kind of helps to have somebody guide you in that way, because it makes you a better writer having that criticism.
Right. You mentioned earlier that you don't consider yourself to be a fantasy author or anything other than what you are. Your new book, The Shadow Key.
Yeah.
And I'm just popping up the Amazon link here on the screen. And TW said, awesome. Thank you for that answer. The Shadow Key is such a fun read. It is, I would not call it fantasy, but I would call it fantastical.
Okay,
there are elements to the story, and this is another thing that me as a writer, I feel similar to this. I'm probably never going to write an epic fantasy, but I love stories about the normal world where there's just something a little extra going on. There's something behind the thing that maybe is going on.
Yeah, me too.
And those are the things that really, really intrigue me. And it's probably the reason that I loved this book so much. There's so much going on in this book, from the Hellfire Clubs, which I'd always just heard of the Hellfire Club. I didn't realize that this was a multiplicity of things.
Yeah.
Where did but for me, I'll start collecting little nuggets of information, and like, this thing intrigues me. And all of a sudden I'll see a connection between the two. It's like, oh, what if this happened and this happened, and boom, a story comes. What were some of the initial discoveries or connections that you started making that then formed the story in your subconscious somehow?
Right. Well, the Shadow Key evolved in various different ways. This was an idea I've had since 2006. The initial premise was it was going to be a Gothic novel set in Wales, which is where I live, and North Wales, Snowdonia way specifically. I live in the county of Gwynedd, which back then was called Meirionydd. And so I knew I wanted to write a really darkly Gothic novel that was heavily centered around that area. Lynette came first because I wanted there to be a punky female who wouldn't take any. I can't swear on this, can I? She was She just didn't want to be trodden over. She was a very
Sure.
strong-minded woman. The idea of Henry, I had actually in 2015, but I hadn't necessarily decided to kind of mix him into this novel. But somehow it happened, and I wanted there to be a play between the kind of the mythical folklore of Wales,
Mm-hmm.
and then the very real scientific element of Henry's character, but also playing about with the idea that the supernatural was actually something that people of the Georgian era were actually interested in, specifically the aristocrats, the beau monde, as you would necessarily say by then. And so I knew that playing about with the occult, that there had to be some sort of way in. And for me, that came by researching how the aristocracy might have got involved with that. And so there's something called the Grand Tour back in the Georgian period, and this was basically, it was a bit like a finishing school for the upper class, primarily men who would go traveling around Europe, usually with a tutor in hand, and they'd learn about life. They would further their education in many different ways, some of them physical, and many would have encountered certain religious beliefs. So Georgian United Kingdom at that time, it would have been predominantly Protestant. The European countries were predominantly Catholic. So the idea of heaven, hell, and the Holy Trinity, these were very, very real things for these people. And so it's not too far out of the realms of ridiculous to think that some of these aristocrats might have come across certain spiritual books that weren't necessarily the Bible. And some of them did do that. So it's, like I said, it's not completely made up on my part. The first Hellfire Club, they weren't even called Hellfire Clubs. Hellfire Clubs, they were basically secret societies that emerged in Britain and Ireland, and they were infamous essentially for their debauchery and their anti-religious sentiments and generally rebellious activities. And it was basically a grown men's club. It allowed them to be controversial outside of the kind of it allowed them to subvert the traditional authority, the societal norms, all that kind of thing, away from the prying eyes of, let's say, London. And the first Hellfire Club, it was founded in London, circa like 1718, by a man called the Duke of Wharton. He was an eccentric aristocrat and politician. And his was the first, but by no means the last. And various different ones came out in subsequent years, and they were influenced heavily by paganism and rebellion and the Enlightenment. And yeah, they really kind of went into it, as far as they possibly could, to the point where the most notorious one was founded, I'd say probably in the 1740s, I think, and it was founded by the infamous rake, Sir Francis Dashwood. So he was an English politician, another one, and Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was a man very, very high up in the social sphere.
Yeah.
They weren't known, as I said, as Hellfire Clubs. That was something that these clubs were kind of dubbed years later. This one, the one by Francis Dashwood, it was known as the Monks of Medmenham Abbey, or Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Wicket. They liked very, very airy-fairy names. And it was rumoured, because they really kind of didn't hide it that well, to be perfectly honest. And there were rumours that devil worship was involved. And they would dress up as characters from the Bible, and they would really they would make a mockery of Christianity, essentially.
Yeah.
And really, that is where it all came from. I thought, what's the opposite of heaven and gods? Obviously, it's the devil and hell. But I thought using the devil, the actual devil, was just a little bit too tongue-in-cheek. So I decided to look at demonology, basically. And with that came the idea of demons. And it was just such a fascinating thing to kind of get into. And it took ages to kind of really kind of pin it down to one demon in particular. And I could have been there for ages. But it was a lot of fun to research, basically. And I just really loved the idea of playing with something that had a basis in actual history.
Right.
But again, it's that the ambiguity of it. That is it, isn't it? The demon I mention in the Shadow Key is apparently a real one. It's listed in the Lesser Key as Solomon. Solomon built his temple using these demons, and Solomon is mentioned in the Bible. So again, this is all kind of, I say fact loosely, but you know what I mean.
Right.
It's all there in history.
Right.
But how real they were is a completely different matter. But then if we consider that this is a novel that's based in Wales, where myth and magic and folklore is so heavily ingrained into their society, it was just a fun thing to play with. All of this was real to them. The Tylwyth Teg, the Coblenai, they were all creatures that for them existed.
Yeah.
So who's to say that the Hellfire Club of my novel didn't also believe that their demon existed as well? It was just fun. It was fun to play about with.
And Wales is such an interesting setting. It's there are lots of stories based in the UK and in England proper, in Scotland, in Ireland. Wales is, especially for us Americans, Wales is this mysterious place that just doesn't get talked about a whole lot. Their language is so out of the realm of us English speakers trying to pronounce the linguistic gymnastics that go into
it's a tricky language.
So we're just like Wales is that part that hangs off the left of England that we just don't talk about. But there's so much interesting history and folklore that is for a storyteller, what a rich place. I understand that you have a connection to what you just said, that you lived in Wales now. How long have you lived there, and are you kind of looked on as the outsider who's come in?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So my childhood holidays were all spent caravanning in Wales. So I'm from the Midlands originally, so the centre of England. So it's from a city called Lichfield. It's actually the birthplace of Dr. Johnson, maker of the dictionary. That's my little kind of claim to fame there. But in that area of England, it does tend to be a standard thing where we will go left, we will holiday in Wales. And because, again, as I mentioned earlier, I was from a low-income family, we couldn't really afford to go abroad. So we would take the caravan, and our summer holidays were spent in Wales. And that, my earliest memories were of Wales. I must have been going earlier than 4, but I'd say from 4 onwards, definitely, that was where I spent all of my summers. And we stayed with a friend who would, she'd always have a piece of land that we could just park the caravan on. And so I know I'd wake up in the morning to birdsong and the bleating of sheep and the mountains and the sea. And it was just something that I fell in love with. And it just has a very special place in my heart. So for many, many years, we holidayed in Wales, and that cemented my decision to go to university in Wales. So I went to Aberystwyth University. That's in the county Ceredigion, which is the county next on from Gwynedd, which is where I am now. Now, obviously, I said earlier, once I graduated, I had to go get a job. And so I I did leave Wales, and I lived in London, and then I moved to the Midlands again for a bit. But Wales always called me back. I have just such a fondness for this country that I loved it for so long, and I always just felt so peaceful and happy here. And so I didn't actually commit to moving here officially until November 2021. And I've been there ever since. But I was coming back all the time, and I worked for Aberystwyth University for a time as well. That's the job where I did a lot of driving.
Right.
So yes, I was always going to have this intrinsic connection to this country. And in terms of, do I feel like an outsider? I am not the only person. I'm not the only English person that has moved to Wales.
Sure.
And I think it depends on whereabouts in Wales that you are. I live on the northwest coast in the Snowdonia National Park,
Okay.
which is probably a little bit more Welsh than maybe down south. The language is it's spoke predominantly in all of Wales, but I feel it's very heavy the further up north that you go. So I can still go into a shop and I can hear Welsh being spoken. I have tried 3 times to learn Welsh. Unfortunately, I do not have a head for languages. I've tried to learn French, Italian, German, and Japanese as well, and it just doesn't stay.
Yeah.
But having lived here and kind of at least lived or visited for so long, I can at least look at a Welsh word and 9 times out of 10 know exactly how to pronounce it, and I can have a basic vocabulary of Welsh, which means that when I go into a shop, I won't necessarily start a conversation in Welsh because then they think I am Welsh and I have to say, no, sorry, that's it, that's all you got. But I'll definitely kind of leave on Welsh. And I think that little bit of effort definitely helps, because when I'm in a predominantly Welsh speaking area of Wales, there is always, oh, it's another tourist, it's another English person. Not in any kind of bad way. I'm not saying I've ever been, spoken to nicely, but there's a reserve there. It's a very kind of obvious reserve, which is fair because the English weren't great. Not to the Welsh. I say it in the novel. But when I do speak a bit of Welsh at them, I do feel there's a warming there. And so I try to do that whenever I can.
Well, and there's so much dynamic folklore that comes from that area that is so untapped, if that's a way to say it, in popular literature. That there's so much there that's got to be. I could only imagine that living in the area, that just absorbing all of that culture is, because it's so underrepresented in our in popular literature, in fantasy or fantastical literature. That's got to be so fun to live there.
It is amazing. I mean, saying that though, Tolkien was inspired by the Welsh language, so he did use it a lot. So for his Elvish, so the country has influenced so many. It's just it's not always obvious, is it? It's a shame. It's such a shame.
It is a shame. Well, if we know anything about publishing, and you publishing on multiple continents makes it even more strange. The Shadow Key has been off your desk for quite a while now. You published it in the UK, and now it's just come out in the US here just last week, I believe it was. Was publication date. What are you working on now?
A couple of things. So I have a short story collection in the works and a novel. So the short story collection isn't gothic at all. It is actually the 12 Days of Christmas. So the actual carol, the lyrics for the 12 Days of Christmas were actually written in the 1780s, which makes me very happy, because obviously being a Georgian buff, I'm like, and I thought, wait a minute, why has nobody ever kind of written any kind of short stories about the 12 Days of Christmas? So my idea is basically 12 stories, each revolving around one of the 12 gifts.
Right.
But it's going to be done in the vein of Jane Austen and Georgette Hare, because those were my initial loves. As I said earlier, I kind of really immersed myself into 18th century literature. So these are going to be very light, fun, kind of heartwarming, so to
Yeah.
speak, Regency tales, and that's going to be due to be released in the UK in autumn, late autumn next year. My novel, I will always probably write my novels with an element of gothic and with an element of that fantastical ambiguity that I so love. The novel is actually going to be set in Prague in 1765, and it's going to revolve around the Orloj, which is the very beautiful astronomical clock that's there in the old town. It's called The Constellations. It's going to be about fate and reckoning, the ability to rise above the ashes, to renew yourself, and it's going to lean heavily into astrology and astronomy, and yeah, that idea of how much do the stars actually have any sort of, I don't know, relevance to our fate. And
Oh,
I'm going to leave it loose like that. It's
yeah,
still a
yeah.
work in progress.
I'm intrigued. I'll say that I'm intrigued. Well, Susan, this has been so much fun chatting. Your new book, The Shadow Key, is amazing. I know we really just kind of danced around everything that the book is about. It's about all of that and so much more. It's available everywhere. When you're hearing this, I'm sure it's available at your local bookstore. So if you have a great local bookstore, go grab a copy. Support local books. If you don't have a great local bookstore, we'll put links to it in the show notes to make it easy for folks to find. If folks are just discovering you, Susan, and want to dig into all the great stuff that you're up to, your back catalog, published books, what's coming next, news of all that good stuff, where is a place that they can locate, find you online, and follow along for new news?
So I do have a website. It's www.susanstokes-chapman.com. It's a mouthful. I'm very sorry, but type it in. It's all there. And I have links to my Instagram, my Twitter, a TikTok, which I've only just launched. There's nothing on there yet, but bear with me. It's going to happen. But I have a newsletter there as well that I do sporadic updates with. So I'm not going to bombard you with loads of different things, but I have an events page and a news kind of reel. So everything that you need to know is going to be on there.
Excellent. We'll link that up as well to make it easier for folks to find you. Susan, thank you so much for being so kind and generous with your time.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I've had a lot of fun.